In this episode of Idea City,
Canadians support choice in dying. Depending on the poll, and the audience support ranges from 2/3 to 80%. While there are still some doctors who oppose the laws being changed, there are others who support a change and are willing to publicly speak out. And nurses and social workers have a strong majority in favor of choice at end of life.
Moses Neimer's Idea City Conference. Ideas change the world.
It appears that the Canadian public is running well ahead of the policymakers and the politicians. I call the session Legalize It. And it has to do with the fact that a solid majority of Canadians appear to favor humane, medically assisted suicide where pain is insurmountable and all hope is lost. This majority, by the way, becomes a supermajority in the province of Quebec, where support for this proposition approaches 80%. The question that this session asks is, does there come a moment, a tipping point, when resisting the common will, for no easily defined reason, stops making social or even economic sense and reveals itself to be nothing more than fanaticism? So, we will begin with Wanda Morris.
My friend Jan is a lovely Irish lass. She moved to Canada about 30 years ago and liked it very much, even though she moved to Toronto. The day that Nagy met Jan, he was smitten. Nagy was a cheese merchant. And with the tang of Stilton, the sharpness of cheddar, and the creaminess of camembert, he wooed her and he won her heart. Many good weeks and months passed, and then one day, Nagy came to Jan's apartment, distraught and disheveled. "Jan," he said, "there's something you need to know. I want to marry you. But my father had Huntington disease, and there is a 50% chance that I too am a carrier." And Jan said, "Nagy, whatever the future brings, we will face it together." Many years later, a test was developed for the Huntington gene. Nagy came from a family of 3 boys. The 3 brothers took the test. One of them was a carrier. Nagy had the Huntington gene. Sometime later, he was surfing the internet, and he came across an organization called Dying with Dignity Canada. And he felt a profound sense of relief to know that he needn't follow in his father's footsteps. When the time came and his suffering was unbearable, he could have support to hasten his dying. He could have a gentle death. Huntington is a disease that affects the muscles of the body, causing spasticity. And Nagy was experiencing that more and more, with uncontrolled limb movement, uncontrollable facial tics. He was also experiencing changes in his personality and his thinking skills. He was not ready to die, but he knew that if his window closed, he faced a horrible choice. If he waited until the point where he was no longer able to end his own life, he would either have to wait for his natural death or ask Jan or someone that he loved to help him, imperiling their future, potentially putting them at risk of 14 years in prison. On April 22nd of this year, Earth Day, Nagy ended his life. He was not alone, but he went far too early. Nagy was 53 years old. The tragedy of our current laws is that good people like Nagy, leave far too early because they're not able to have medically assisted dying at the point when they would choose to end their lives. Medically assisted dying is an umbrella term, and it really refers to two things. In the state of Oregon, physician-assisted dying, also called physician-assisted suicide, refers to the ability of someone who is terminally ill to get a prescription for a lethal dose. But what about someone like Nagy, who doesn't have the motor control to take the dose, or someone with throat cancer who can't swallow? The Netherlands has a different alternative where not only can individuals get the dose, but they can also be assisted by a physician directly with an injection to help them painlessly die. We need to have choice in dying not only for the individuals who suffer at end of life, but to prevent the trauma of families after individuals take violent means to end their lives.
Get the latest Idealist news, presenter information, and watch streaming video at ideacityonline.com. Moses Znaimer's Idea City Conference. Ideas change the world.
When I first got involved with the Right to Die movement, I kind of wondered why assistance was necessary. I thought that when my time came, I'd simply take a bottle of Tylenol, swish down a couple of glasses of champagne, and go gently into the good night. The reality is it's very hard to have a gentle death. Brain damage, yes. Organ failure, yes. But that peaceful death generally requires some type of assistance. We need to have choice in dying not only for the individuals who suffer at end of life, but to prevent the trauma of families after individuals take violent means to end their lives. According to Statistics Canada, the 3 primary ways individuals end their lives are by hanging, by self-poisoning, and if you're a man, with firearms; if you are a woman, by jumping off something high or in front of something fast. It's interesting that we take away choice at end of life when choice is the fundamental cornerstone of our medical system. In 1992 in Quebec, there was a woman by the name of Nancy B. Nancy B was paralyzed from the neck down, and she was on a ventilator. And she'd made the decision that she didn't want to continue on that ventilator, didn't want to continue to live. Her doctors were very concerned about that, didn't want to remove the ventilator, didn't want to cause certain death. The case went through the courts in Quebec, and the courts affirmed Nancy B, affirmed that she had the right, as indeed all Quebecers would, to stop or refuse treatment. Now, virtually every province has some type of healthcare consent regulation. There is not one exam, one diagnostic procedure, one test that can be done to us without explicit consent. Choice is embedded in our system. Yet, the most critical choice that we want to make, the choice at end of life, is taken from us. We don't have the choice to have compassionate assistance if we need it. If we're someone on insulin, a diabetic, we can stop the insulin. If we need dialysis, we can stop the treatment. But if our only hope is that someone will assist us to gently die, right now, we're out of luck. With so many good reasons to support choice in dying, why isn't it legal? If we put aside the arguments of the fundamental religious community, there are really 2 primary concerns. The first is that of the slippery slope, the idea that, sure, we want to allow people like Nagy, like Sue Rodriguez, to have assistance to die, but if we were to do that, the weak and the vulnerable would be unprotected. In 1994, Sue Rodriguez took her case to the Supreme Court of Canada. She asked the question, who owns my life? Her argument was based on Section 15 of the Charter. She said, since 1972, Canadians have had the right to end their own lives. But I have ALS, I have a disability, I cannot end my life, therefore I need assistance. And to deprive me of that assistance is to violate my rights under Section 15 of the Charter, which says that nobody should be discriminated against on the basis of age, race, religion, or mental or physical handicap. And Justice Sapinka, writing for the majority, the 5-4 majority in the Supreme Court, agreed with Sue Rodriguez. He agreed that indeed her rights were being infringed upon. But he said, it's necessary for us to do so because to allow you this right is to put the weak and the vulnerable at risk. He went on to say that Canadians don't support this, doctors don't support this, and nowhere else in the Western world is this legal. We need to take the practice of assisted dying out of the dark corners of our culture and expose it to the light of day, to put safeguards in place and to regulate it, and to make sure that the suffering of those at end of life is relieved.
Great ideas are meant to be shared. Join the discussion on Facebook. Moses Znaimer's Idea City Conference. Ideas change the world.
Here we are, almost 20 years later, and the world has changed. In 2011, Gloria Taylor signed on as a co-plaintiff to the Carter case. She also had ALS, and the case in Carter is very strong. Canadians support choice in dying. Depending on the poll, and the audience support ranges from 2/3 to 80%. While there are still some doctors who oppose the laws being changed, there are others who support a change and are willing to publicly speak out. And nurses and social workers have a strong majority in favor of choice at end of life. But perhaps most importantly, we have 5 jurisdictions who have written legislation about choice in dying. And this has been perhaps the most studied healthcare legislation ever written. One study by Professor Margaret Papsbatten out of the University of Utah, published in the British peer-reviewed Journal of Medical Ethics, looked at who was using the legislation. Was there evidence to see that it was in fact the weak and vulnerable that were being coerced? And what she found was that the predominant user of the legislation was white, well-educated, and male. It was the privileged, not the weak and vulnerable, who were asking for assistance to die. The other concerning factor is some statistics that are sometimes published, especially by the religious right, sometimes referred to as the Remlink report. They talk about numbers of individuals, 1,000, maybe 500, assisted to die, or killed, as they would say, against their will in the Netherlands. When I first heard those numbers, I was deeply concerned. In fact, I worried that I was working for the wrong side. But I'm a chartered accountant by training, an auditor, and so I wanted to look into those numbers and see what was behind them. And when I understood the context, it told a very different story. Studies were indeed done in the Netherlands to look at assisted death without explicit consent. Here is what Dying with Dignity advocates for choice in dying at the end of life for mentally competent adults who voluntarily request it. Over here is involuntary assistance to die. Nobody is advocating for that. We have another word for that. It's called murder, and we have laws to protect against it. In the middle is this gray area, assisted death without explicit request. Somebody might be in a coma, unable to speak. Their doctor might believe they're acting on their behalf, and their death can be assisted without explicit consent. Those numbers were 0.7% of all deaths in the Netherlands prior to legislation. But after the legislation passed, the number went down to 0.4%. In Belgium, the number was 3.2% prior to legalization, and then just with the discussions of legalization happening in Belgium, the number went down to 1.8%. Then some English-speaking researchers said, I wonder if these numbers would hold elsewhere or if they're just in Europe. So they translated the tools and did the same studies in New Zealand and Australia, where choice in dying is not legal. And what they found there was an assisted death without explicit consent was about 3% in both of those countries too. And we have no reason to believe it's any different in Canada. If there's anything we can learn from those studies, it's that legalizing choice in dying actually seems to reduce the amount of death without explicit consent. We need to take the practice of assisted dying out of the dark corners of our culture and expose it to the light of day, to put safeguards in place and to regulate it, and to make sure that the suffering of those at end of life is relieved. As part of my role, I speak across the country, and so very often, when I'm finished speaking, there'll be someone waiting to talk to me. They'll tell me their story, and sometimes I'm the first person that's heard their story. They'll tell me about a mother or a sister with cancer or ALS who begged for help to die. And they'll tell me how they helped. Maybe they went on the internet and found the drugs. Maybe they crushed the pills. Maybe they held the glass. Maybe they even made a solemn promise that whatever happened, they would take whatever measures were necessary so their loved one would never wake up to pain and suffering again. And maybe they had to take some steps to keep that promise. And there isn't a day that's gone by in the years or the decades since that's happened that they haven't thought about it. And yet, as they replay it over and over in their mind, they realize that given the same situation today, they would act in the same way again. We need to provide choice in dying so that individuals have access in an upfront, clearly regulated mechanism. In 3 years' time, the Supreme Court of Canada could overrule the current law, could decriminalize assisted dying. At that point, at that time, we need to have a groundswell of public opinion.
Get the latest Idea City news instantly. Follow us on Twitter. Moses Znaimer's Idea City Conference. Ideas change the world.
At Dying with Dignity, we have about 1,800 members across the country, and many of those are individuals who joined because of personal traumatic experience. One of those was a woman by the name of Meg Wesley. At 75, Meg's mother had breast cancer. Now, this lovely, gracious Southern belle had a mastectomy, but 3 years later, the cancer had metastasized. It had traveled through her bones, it had traveled into her brain. And when Meg came to visit her, she found her lying on her bed, and there she would be, bald from the chemotherapy, blind in one eye from the brain tumor, with a disfiguring hump on her back from the bone cancer, looking up at Meg and saying, "Why? Why am I still here? Why can't I die?" And this went on. She couldn't take the narcotics for the pain that caused her. She threw them up, so she was in agony for 9 months until she finally took the steps to stop eating and drinking to hasten her dying. And at that point, even though she only weighed 90 pounds, it took her a further 10 days to die. Meg decided to get involved with Dying with Dignity. She joined our organization, then became a board member, and is now the president of our board. In 3 years' time, the Supreme Court of Canada could overrule the current law, could decriminalize assisted dying. At that point, at that time, we need to have a groundswell of public opinion that says to the federal parliament very clearly, this is the law that we want changed, and this is what we want. We need to have thousands, hundreds of thousands of Canadians that are supporting choice at the end of life so that the parliamentarians know absolutely what they need to do. Martin Luther King said, "In the end, we will not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." I encourage you not to be silent. You can check out our website at righttochoose.ca. There's a lot of great information on there. Most importantly, we need you to join us to speak out. There are many that suffer grievously at end of life and need another choice. We need to be their voice. Thank you.
I'd like to say that considering the legal risks that people in this organization take and the undeniable emotional risks of not only advocating but also sharing and witnessing some of these departures, right? I think these are some of the most saintly people that I've ever met who walk the walk as well as talk the talk.
Idea City is a place where ideas come face to face to inspire and give us hope. At this time our planet needs it most. Idea City is a place. Everybody sing. Where ideas come face to face to inspire and give us hope. At this time our planet needs it most. Idea City, gotta bring our ideas to Idea City, where ideas come face to face to inspire and give us hope. At this time, our planet needs it.